You know, there's something strange about human behavior that we don't often recognize until we're standing on the other side of heartbreak. Until we've finally stopped fighting to be seen, to be heard, to be loved. It's that moment when you've given up, not in bitterness, but in clarity, that everything begins to change. And perhaps the most baffling part is this: she comes back. Not when you tried the hardest. Not when you poured your soul out in desperation. Not when you sacrificed your dignity for attention. No, she comes back when you stop trying. Why does that happen? Why is the pursuit met with resistance, but your absence becomes magnetic? It's because the human psyche doesn't respond to pressure the way we imagine it should. When someone knows that they have you completely, unquestionably, no matter how they treat you, your value in their eyes shifts. It's not some cold, calculated manipulation. It's something deeper, something evolutionary. When effort is not required to maintain attention, the mind starts to assume that it's no longer valuable. We're drawn to what eludes us. And when you stop trying, when you let go, when you withdraw your emotional energy, not as a game, but as a truth, something powerful takes place. You shift the dynamic. You break the pattern. You stop feeding into the cycle where your self-worth is tied to how much you can do to be chosen. And in that vacuum, something starts to stir in her. A discomfort, a question, a realization that perhaps you weren't as dependent on her as she believed. That perhaps you were the one with the strength to walk away from what wasn't right. That maybe, just maybe, you weren't begging to be kept. You were simply trying to be understood. And when that moment hits her, when she feels that cold space where once your warmth used to be, there's a psychological reversal that occurs. It's a form of emotional withdrawal, not unlike what happens when an addict loses their substance of choice. The presence that used to be consistent is now gone. The validation that used to be automatic has evaporated. And the ego, her ego, doesn't like not being the center, doesn't like not having the option to come and go as it pleases. Your silence is now louder than your words ever were. But here's the key. This shift only happens when your detachment is real. You can't fake it. You can't half step into it while secretly hoping she'll notice and come running back. Because if you're still waiting at the door, watching for her return, you haven't truly stopped trying, you're just pretending. And people, especially those who've gotten used to taking you for granted, can sense that. Real detachment is an internal transformation. It's the moment you no longer feel the need to prove your worth to someone who couldn't see it when you were right in front of them. It's the moment your peace becomes more important than their attention. And what happens then is not always a fairy tale. She might come back, yes, but not always with genuine love or renewed clarity. Sometimes she comes back because her control slipped, because she wants to know if you're still available, because your silence became unbearable, not because she changed, but because she lost something she assumed would always be there. And if you're not careful, if you haven't truly detached, you'll fall back into the same cycle, mistaking her return for redemption. You have to understand the depth of this dynamic. The power in your absence isn't about punishing her. It's not about playing games or manipulating emotions. It's about reclaiming yourself. When you stop trying, you begin to heal. You begin to see how much of yourself you gave away just to keep someone who was never fully present. And in that awareness, you become dangerous. Not to others, but to your former self. The one who settled, the one who tolerated, the one who made excuses in the name of love. And now, without even trying, you radiate something different. Confidence, self-respect, mystery, the very things that people are drawn to, especially those who once overlooked them in you. And it's in that space where you've stopped reaching out, where you've stopped justifying your presence, that she might start reaching in. Not because you need her to, but because you finally stopped needing her at all. And that, paradoxically, is when they come back, people don't value what they think they can always have. It's a brutal truth, but it's deeply embedded in human psychology. When something or someone is constantly available, the mind begins to take it for granted. Not maliciously, not even consciously, but subtly, gradually, it becomes part of the background like white noise. And this is the tragedy of many relationships. One person gives everything, time, affection, energy, without reservation, hoping that their consistency will be enough, hoping that by always being there, they'll prove their worth. But instead, what often happens is the opposite. Their presence becomes expected, not cherished. Familiarity dulls appreciation. Scarcity triggers value perception. That's not just a marketing principle, it's a psychological law. When you withdraw your attention, when your presence is no longer guaranteed, something shifts in the other person's mind. The brain starts to reevaluate. Questions arise. Why aren't they trying anymore? Did I lose them? Was I wrong to assume they'd always be there? And in that moment, the emotional dynamic starts to change. What was once overlooked becomes intriguing. What was once assumed becomes uncertain. And uncertainty activates desire in a way that certainty never can. When you were always available, there was no urgency, no mystery, no tension. And those things matter. They're part of the emotional chemistry that makes people feel alive in relationships, not chaos. Don't mistake this for unhealthy instability. It's about emotional contrast. If someone can predict your every move, your every response, your every effort to fix things, they stop feeling the need to earn it. And if they don't have to earn your presence, they stop respecting it. You might think that being consistently available is a sign of loyalty, and in a healthy relationship, that's true. But when the dynamic is unbalanced, when your availability isn't being met with equal investment, it becomes counterproductive. The more you give, the less they feel they need to. The more you try, the less they value the effort. And then you wonder why they seem distant, why they're no longer impressed, why your devotion doesn't seem to move them. It's not because you weren't good enough. It's because what you offered was no longer rare. And what's no longer rare is no longer exciting. That's why your absence has more impact than your words. Your silence creates more reflection than your explanations. When you pull back, not to punish, but to preserve yourself, you allow the other person to feel the weight of your value. And here's the thing, people remember how you made them feel, but more importantly, they remember how it felt when you were gone. The void speaks volumes. When your energy is no longer in their life, they begin to realize what it carried. Not just affection, but stability. Not just love, but intention. And now that absence creates contrast between what they had and what they now miss. It's in that contrast that desire often returns. But let's be honest, sometimes it's not pure desire. Sometimes it's ego. Sometimes it's the panic of losing control, but other times it's clarity, a painful realization that they didn't see your worth until it was no longer available on demand. And if that realization is genuine, it will come with changed behavior. Not just words, not just apologies, but action. You'll know the difference. You always do when you're no longer desperate to be chosen. What matters most is that you stop trying to prove your worth to someone who couldn't see it when it was right in front of them. You don't need to chase what's real. You don't need to beg for recognition. If someone only begins to notice your value when you disappear, ask yourself, did they ever truly value you, or did they just enjoy the convenience of your presence? Scarcity does not mean manipulation, it means boundaries. It means recognizing that your time, your heart, your energy are finite resources, not to be wasted on someone who only pays attention when they start losing you. When you stop trying, when you pull back your focus, you give them a chance to realize something. You were never just an option. You were the standard. And if they couldn't see that, then stepping away is the most powerful thing you could ever do. Because what's rare is respected. What's respected is protected. And what's protected is never taken for granted. There's a shift that happens when you stop trying. One that goes far beyond surface level behavior. It's not just about the absence of your text messages or the silence where your calls used to be. It's something much deeper. When you no longer show up to validate someone who once depended on your emotional investment, you create an internal disruption in them. They may not admit it, they may not even understand it at first, but it's there, quietly unraveling the illusion of control they once held. Because when someone is used to your constant presence, your predictable affection, and your willingness to explain yourself time and time again, your disappearance becomes a kind of emotional mirror. You were giving them something more than attention. You were giving them stability, you were giving them a sense of importance. And for some people, especially those who struggle with insecurity or ego, your attention becomes their emotional currency. It's how they measure their worth, not in their own eyes, but through your reactions, your efforts, your sacrifices. And when that supply disappears, it doesn't just feel like distance, it feels like a threat to their identity, to their sense of significance. That's when they begin to spiral, not because they lost love, but because they lost a mirror. The truth is, people don't always want connection. Sometimes they just want confirmation. They want to feel wanted, pursued, desired, because it quiets their internal noise. And if you were the one always trying, always chasing, always showing up, even after being dismissed, you became their reassurance. Not necessarily their partner in a meaningful way, but their emotional safety net. And when that net is gone, when you no longer offer them that soft place to land, it shakes them, forces them to ask questions they were never prepared to face. Why aren't they chasing me? Why doesn't it bother them anymore? Have I lost my hold on them? That space, that uncertainty breeds discomfort. But it also breeds curiosity, because the mind fixates on what's unresolved, on what it can't fully understand. And when you stop validating someone who relied on your emotional energy, you become that unresolved equation, that missing piece. That silence that echoes louder than your words ever did. There's something unnerving about being ignored by someone who used to try so hard. It triggers a kind of internal dissonance, especially if they were used to being the one who could pull the strings. And this is where the game begins. So you're not playing it. This is where they start to test the waters, subtly, indirectly. A random message, a passive comment, a social media post meant to provoke. They're not reaching out for reconciliation. They're reaching out for reassurance, to see if they still matter, to see if you'll flinch, to see if you'll bite. But when you don't, when you remain silent, centered, unmoved, they feel the full weight of the validation they've lost, and that weight becomes unbearable. But here's what you have to understand. Just because someone comes back doesn't mean they've changed. Sometimes they come back because their ego needs repair, because their confidence took a hit when you stopped reacting. They don't miss you. They miss how you made them feel. They miss the power. They miss the control. They miss being at the center of your emotional world. And if you let them back in without discernment, they'll slip right into the same role, repeating the same cycles, expecting the same attention. Only now, it's even more dangerous, because now they know what it takes to get you back. You must be brutally honest with yourself. Are they returning because they love you, or because they miss the comfort of being validated without having to earn it? Did they finally realize your worth, or did they just lose the part of themselves that depended on your approval? These are questions you can only answer from a place of emotional clarity, not longing, because longing will trick you. It will dress up familiarity as affection. It will call attention, beloved. It will disguise manipulation as closure. And that's why detachment is necessary, not to punish, but to protect. You're not withholding validation out of spite, you're reclaiming it. You're choosing to stop feeding someone's sense of self-worth at the cost of your own. You're choosing to stop being the fallback, the lifeline, the emotional crutch. Because when someone only values you for what you can give them emotionally, not for who you are, you're not in a relationship. You're in a transaction. You can love someone and still walk away. You can care and still choose peace. And often, when you finally stop trying, when you stop giving them the reassurance they took for granted, they come back not to love you, but to soothe themselves. And that's when you realize that the most powerful kind of love is the one you give to yourself, the kind that doesn't need to be validated to be real. What people often misunderstand about strength is that it doesn't always look like loud declarations or emotional outbursts. Real strength, especially in a man, is quiet, it's disciplined, it's controlled. And perhaps the greatest form of strength you can exhibit in a relationship is the ability to remain non-reactive, to stop chasing, to stop trying to convince someone of your worth, and to simply stand firm in who you are. That's not indifference, it's maturity, it's emotional sovereignty. And that's what begins to separate you from the kind of man who's easily manipulated or discarded. See, high-value masculinity isn't about dominance or bravado. It's about emotional clarity. It's about knowing what you offer and refusing to beg for someone to notice it. Because when you operate from a place of emotional neediness, you become predictable. You become controllable. You're no longer acting from strength. you're reacting from fear. And people, especially women who are testing your boundaries, can sense that. They sense when you're still trying to win them over. They sense when your peace depends on their approval. And as long as they sense that, you will never be fully respected. You'll be tolerated. You might even be desired in moments, but you won't be respected. Respect is the foundation. Without it, love deteriorates. And here's what you need to understand. When you stop trying, when you stop showing up in ways that signal emotional dependency, you're not giving up. You're giving up the illusion of control. You're stepping back into your frame, and your frame is everything. It's how you hold yourself. It's how you respond to chaos. It's how you maintain composure when everything inside you wants to fix, to chase, to rescue. That's why some women come back, not because you finally found the right words or the perfect gesture, but because you stopped reacting. You stopped orbiting them. You stopped placing them at the center of your emotional world. And that shift is powerful. It disrupts the narrative. It removes the game. It reveals something essential, that you don't need them to feel whole. You're not desperate. You're not fragile. You're not waiting to be saved. And in a world where so many men are bending over backwards for attention, validation, affection, your stillness becomes a force. It's not arrogance. It's not manipulation. It's rooted in a deep understanding that true connection isn't forced. It's reciprocal. That the right woman won't require you to chase endlessly just to be seen, and the wrong one will never fully appreciate you no matter how hard you try. That's why when you stop trying, when you stop overextending, it's not the end, it's the beginning of your real power. But that power only emerges when your detachment is real, when your sense of identity is no longer tied to her opinion of you, when you're no longer afraid to walk away from what doesn't meet your standards. And that's the paradox. The less you try to prove yourself, the more your presence speaks for itself. The more you let go of needing someone, the more attractive you become, because now you're operating from strength, not scarcity. And that's when she starts to notice the silence, the calm, the absence of anxiety in your presence. You're no longer chasing her emotionally. You're no longer offering reassurance every time she pulls away. You're no longer negotiating your self-worth for a few breadcrumbs of attention. You've become the man who knows what he brings to the table and refuses to beg anyone to sit with him. It doesn't mean you're cold. It doesn't mean you're dismissive. It means your heart is no longer for sale to the highest bidder. It means you've found a kind of confidence that isn't loud but unwavering. And for many women, that's when the attraction returns. Not because you played hard to get, but because you finally became hard to shake. You became grounded, unshakable. Not in a way that demands control, but in a way that refuses to be controlled. And when she does come back, and many do, it's not always out of love. Sometimes it's curiosity. Sometimes it's regret. Sometimes it's the magnetic pull of a man who no longer makes her feel like the prize. Because now she senses that you've become the prize. That your time, your energy, your affection are not given out freely, but with intention. That you are no longer the man who tries, you are the man who chooses. Because when you stop trying, you stop needing. And when you stop needing, you start leading people. Notice the absence of what they used to take for granted. Not always immediately, but eventually, and it's often in your silence, your total and consistent disengagement, that reality begins to hit them. Not because you said something profound, not because you launched into some long explanation of your pain, but because you stopped showing up entirely. You stopped feeding the cycle. You stopped giving them the comfort of knowing that no matter how they treated you, you'd still be there. You removed yourself from the emotional equation, and that act alone rewired the entire dynamic. When you were always available, always responsive, always reaching out, what you gave them was predictability. It gave them a sense of emotional control. They knew how you'd respond. They knew that if they pulled away, you'd try harder. If they pushed your boundaries, you'd forgive. And in that predictability, your presence became routine. It was no longer a gift, but an expectation. And the moment you stop trying, you break that pattern. You interrupt their assumption that you'll always be there, waiting in the background, like a safety net. And when the safety net is gone, people fall into the weight of their own choices. That's the moment they start to wonder, not just where you went, but why. And more importantly, why you're not coming back. Because they remember the version of you that tried. That version was always available, always ready to make things right. Always one call away from surrendering self-respect just to get another chance. But this version of you, the one who walked away quietly and didn't look back, this version haunts them because now they're left alone with their actions. Now they have to face the consequences they never thought would come. And that silence, that absence, speaks louder than anything you could have said. There's an emotional shift that happens when someone realizes they've lost access to you. It's not just the loss of communication. It's the loss of emotional certainty. They no longer know how you feel. They no longer know what you're thinking. And that mystery, that gap, forces them into self-reflection. They start to question what they dismissed. They start to reevaluate the moments they once overlooked. They remember the warmth you brought, the stability you offered, the emotional investment you gave so freely. And the absence of that becomes deafening. But none of that happens if you're still partially available, if you're still liking their posts, if you're still checking their stories, if you're still responding to breadcrumbs. Because every time you do, you keep the door cracked open. And as long as that door is cracked open, they don't feel your absence. They don't truly miss you. They still believe they can have you when it's convenient. That's why full withdrawal matters. That's why total silence is so powerful. It sends a signal that you've chosen yourself, that you've closed the chapter not to manipulate them, but to protect your peace. And that peace, once you fully embrace it, becomes magnetic. Because nothing is more attractive than someone who no longer needs to be seen to feel valuable. Your lack of pursuit is unsettling for someone who fed off your attention. Your refusal to re-engage is confusing to someone who expected you to fold. It forces them to see the strength they never acknowledged. And sometimes it forces them to confront the reality that they lost something they never thought they'd have to fight for. And they come back, and many do. It's often because they've been shaken by that reality. They've replayed the conversations. They've revisited the moments you tried to connect and they chose to ignore. And now, without your presence to stabilize them, they feel that emptiness. But you have to ask yourself, do they miss you? Or do they miss the version of themselves they got to be when you loved them unconditionally? Do they truly see your value now? Or are they just uncomfortable with the silence? Because silence demands clarity. It doesn't give them the emotional feedback they're used to. It doesn't let them know where they stand. And in that uncertainty, they're forced to grow, or at the very least, to feel the consequences of their indifference. That's the kind of transformation silence can create. It doesn't just show them who you are, it shows them who they've been. And it does so without a single word. Sometimes the most powerful statement you can make is walking away and never looking back. When you stop trying, something fundamental shifts in how you're perceived, not only by her, but by yourself. You begin to detach your identity from being the one who's always giving, always proving, always chasing. You start to realize that love, in its most honest form, doesn't require you to lose yourself. And when you stop trying, what you're really doing is reclaiming your power. You're finally choosing self-respect over validation. That choice isn't easy. It feels like loss at first. It feels like failure. But what it really is, what it ultimately becomes, is transformation. There's a quiet dignity in no longer needing someone to recognize your worth in order to feel worthy. That kind of self-assurance doesn't come from ego, it comes from clarity. It comes from pain that's been refined into wisdom. And once you reach that place, you begin to see through the games. You begin to see what was real and what was projection. You begin to understand that the very effort you kept pouring into someone who wouldn't meet you halfway was never about them. It was about a part of you that was hoping love could fix what neglect had broken. And when you let go of that part, when you stop trying to win someone over, you stop living in their emotional frame. You stop basing your peace on their attention or their approval. You stop editing yourself to fit into the version of love they were comfortable with. And that's when everything changes, because now you're no longer trying to earn a seat at their table. You're building your own. And this shift, it's not just noticed, it's felt. People can feel when your energy has changed. They can sense when you've withdrawn not out of spite, but out of clarity, out of truth. And for someone who was used to your effort being a constant, your absence becomes a disturbance. It forces them to reflect, maybe for the first time, on what it meant to have you. Not just your presence, but your care, your loyalty, your effort. That kind of emotional investment doesn't come around often, and once it's gone, it leaves a very particular void. That's why she often comes back, not because you chased, not because you proved anything, but because you stopped doing both. Because in your silence, in your detachment, you gave her a contrast. You gave her space to feel what life looks like without your support, without your warmth, without your devotion. And that space can be disorienting for someone who got used to having you as their emotional contrast. But here's the hard truth. Just because someone comes back doesn't mean they've changed. It doesn't mean they're now capable of giving you the kind of love you needed all along. Sometimes people come back simply because they miss being prioritized without having to prioritize you in return. Sometimes it's not love that pulls them back, it's the discomfort of no longer being pursued, and that's where discernment becomes essential. Because growth on your part means nothing if you slip back into the same dynamic out of loneliness or nostalgia. You have to ask yourself, has anything truly changed, or are they just reacting to the discomfort of losing control? Have they come back to contribute or simply to take again? Are they drawn to you or to the version of themselves they felt safe in when you were doing all the emotional labor? These are questions that demand brutal honesty. Because if you've grown, if you've healed, then the cost of returning to what broke you should feel too high. And it should be, because your peace is no longer up for negotiation. The person you become when you stop trying is not cold, not bitter, not distant. You're just finally aligned. You're finally living in integrity with your values. You're not withholding effort. You're refusing to waste it. You're not rejecting connection. You're refusing to settle for conditional love. And that version of you, the one who no longer performs for affection, is the most powerful version there is. Because he knows his value. He knows his limits. He knows that love, real love, doesn't ask you to abandon yourself. So yes, she might come back, she might reach out, she might finally realize what she had, but that doesn't mean she deserves a second chance. Sometimes closure isn't a conversation, it's a decision, and the decision to stop trying, to really stop, is what frees you to finally start living.